Started. We did have some strikes.
That's fine. Yeah.
In the parking lot. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the event tonight. You're sitting in part of the Lake High School that we share with the public library, and it makes it real nice to have events like this and spread out. So anyway, I want to thank our friends of the library for sponsoring this event tonight. And we also have Kyle's books for sale, and they're in the back. They are $22. He will be signing also, and he'll be sitting over here, so if you'd like to purchase a book and have him sign it, you can do that. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have an interview afterwards with him, so it's going to be a long night for Kyle. He's been out on the road a lot lately. Everyone I've talked to, I heard of that guy. So, Kyle is a Cleveland native, and he currently works for the University of Virginia, the politics as an analyst, and lives in Washington, D.C. So we are so fortunate to have him, especially in the time period that we're facing. And let's hear what he says. See what we are going to do. Because he knows it. So, Kyle,
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me here tonight. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and about Ohio, and then sort of broaden out and talk about the 2016 presidential election and maybe the role that Ohio might play. So my book is called The Bellwether, and the term bellwether is generally used as kind of a leading indicator or a trend. Now, does anyone know why I would have a sheep on the cover of a book called The Bellwether? The reason is that a bellwether is a sheep with a bell around its neck. And the term, it's kind of an archaic term about the sheep that would have the bell around its neck, and so if you hear the bell, you know where the flock is. And the bellwether is frequently castrated, which makes them docile. And so it's kind of a funny image, a poor castrated sheep leading the flock around. And that's the term we use to describe the states that are predicted as a particular president. But so that's the term, and that's why there is a sheep on the cover. So Ohio has the best record of voting with the presidential winner over the last 30 presidential elections. So my book goes back to the year 1896. Ohio's voted with the winner in 28 of 30 elections, and that's the shading. The darker the color on the map, the more often the states vote with the presidential winner. Disregard the numbers. Those are just the number of electoral votes that all the states have currently. So you can see Ohio is generally predictive. Some other states in the Midwest, like Illinois and Missouri, have good records, New Mexico, Nevada, but Ohio at 28 of 30 is the best record of any state. And also, Ohio votes, of all the states, votes closest to the national average typically. Typically, it deviates only about 2 points from the national average over these last 30 presidential elections. And it also votes most often within 5 points of the national average, more often, significantly more often than any other state, which is what this table, which you probably can't read, but that's what it indicates from my book. So the question is why? And I think there are a few reasons why it's the case, so I'll go through them. The first thing is that Ohio has always been reflective of the nation. It's kind of a melting pot for the nation. It started out that way, and I think it's sort of continued that way through its history. So the map on the left is the settlement patterns of Ohio from when it was founded as a state in 1803. And what you have is different groups of people from the original 13 colonies, 13 states, settling in different parts of the state. So in northeast Ohio, that region was called the Western Reserve of Connecticut. A lot of that land in northeast Ohio actually was part of Connecticut, and a lot of people from New England, Connecticut, and other states up there actually settled in northeast Ohio. And so there's this kind of almost a northeastern character to northeast Ohio, and I think that is sort of persisted in the region's politics. In fact, northeast Ohio and Connecticut actually vote quite similarly still today. In the southwest part of the state, you have this big blob of land between Columbus and Cincinnati called the Virginia Military District. that was an area of land that was reserved for Revolutionary War veterans from Virginia. And so you have a lot of Southerners from Virginia and other southern states that end up settling in that part of the state, and other people from different parts of the original country settled in different parts of the state, to the point where Ohio was the 17th state to enter the Union, but in some ways it was the first American state because it was a collection of settlers from across the original 13 states when it was founded. And over time, as the nation changed, Ohio changed too. We got roughly kind of an average number of German immigrants in the 1800s, Irish immigrants in the 1800s, and then more recently in the 20th century, Ohio has had about a national average African American population, and also got different waves of immigrants in the 20th century, particularly from Eastern Europe, and also from places like Italy and Southern Europe as well. And so as those people came in and changed the nation, they changed Ohio too, and Ohio and the nation changed in similar ways, which I think kept our politics in Ohio sort of tethered to the national average. This map on the right, this is from a book called American Nations by a guy named Colin Woodard. This came out about 5-6 years ago. And he portrayed North America as this kind of competing mix of 11 different regional cultures. And in the United States, he portrays our political battles as kind of a conflict between what he calls Yankeedom, which is basically the Northeast and the upper Midwest, adding the left coast recently as an ally, versus the South, so the Deep South, and also Greater Appalachia. And of course, the most obvious battle between North and South was the Civil War, conflict over slavery, but also politically, the North and the South have voted differently for most of our history. And look at where Ohio lies in between North and South. It's kind of a collection of North and South. It's kind of hard to see, but Yankeedom extends into the Connecticut Western Reserve. You have the southern half of Ohio is described as Greater Appalachia, so more southern in character. And then the middle part of Ohio is part of a region he calls the Midlands, which is kind of a swing area, that's sort of a buffer zone between the North and the South. Ohio is one of the few states, based on his definition, that are part of that contain big pieces of 3 different regional cultures. You know, if you look at the Northeast, you know, Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, they're all part of so-called Yankeedom. A lot of the southern states are either part of Appalachia or part of the Deep South. But Ohio is a collection of a lot of different regional cultures, which means that it maybe reflects the nation better than a northeastern state might or a southern state might. Additionally, so Ohio has these different regional cultures, and none of those regions actually dominate the state. So of course we have 3 big cities, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. The counties that contain those cities are Cuyahoga, Cleveland, Franklin, Columbus, and Hamilton, Cincinnati. Combined, those 3 counties cast about 30% of all the statewide votes. And like so many other urban areas across the country, they lean Democratic. Barack Obama got 62% of the vote in those 3 counties combined. So, you know, we have these big urban areas, but they're not as dominant and they don't cast as many votes as some of the other big cities across the country. So of course New York City kind of dominates New York State, and also Chicago dominates Illinois. So Chicago is part of Cook County, and Cook County in Illinois casts about 40%, just that one single county, of all of Illinois' statewide vote. And Cook County is a lot more Democratic than our 3 big urban counties. It voted about 75% for Obama. So if you took Cuyahoga, Franklin, and Hamilton out of Ohio and just set them aside, and if you took Cook out of Illinois and set it aside, Ohio would vote about 5 points, would have voted about 5 points for Mitt Romney in 2012, and the same would have been true of Illinois. The difference is that Illinois has a much bigger, more dominant major city than any of the 3 in Ohio, and even if you put our big 3 together, they don't match Cook County in terms of the share of the statewide vote, and also how democratic those places are. Ohio is a really good mix of urban, suburban, and rural. So in 2012, Obama only won about 20% of the 88 counties in Ohio, but he won 9 of the 10 most populous ones, and that makes sense. Democratic strength is concentrated in urban areas. Obama also only won about 20% of all the counties nationally as well, and again, it's the same pattern. Democratic strength in the cities, Republican strength in the rural areas, and then the suburban areas are kind of a battleground. And so again, you've got this great mix of urban, suburban, and rural in Ohio, and that is also true nationally. This is another way of looking at the state. So this is what we call the political map of Ohio. All the counties are sized by the share of the statewide vote that they cast. And so Northeast Ohio in blue casts the most votes. It's also the most Democratic of these major regions. Central Ohio in purple with Columbus. Basically Franklin County and Columbus, very Democratic. The rest of Central Ohio is Republican, so Central Ohio is kind of a swing region. And then Southwest Ohio, the city of Cincinnati itself is Democratic, but basically the rest of the Southwest is very, very Republican. So here you have these 3 major regions in the state. One's pretty Republican, one is a swing region, and another's pretty Democratic. And you can see how that would sort of average out to a state that's very balanced politically. One other factor is that Ohio does not have a dominant industry. And so this is a list of the Fortune 500 companies in Ohio. Kroger, Marathon, Cardinal Health, P&G, Nationwide, Macy's, Progressive, Goodyear, American Electric Power, First Energy, etc. What do all these industries have in common? Nothing. They're very different. You have, Kroger is a big grocery chain. You have oil companies. You have healthcare providers and healthcare service, technology providers. You have all sorts of things. And so some states will have their politics kind of skewed toward a particular industry that becomes very important in how candidates run statewide in those states. So for instance, West Virginia, coal is very important both culturally and as an employer in West Virginia. So if you're running in West Virginia, you really have to talk about coal. The same is true of agriculture in places like Iowa and Nebraska. Now, we have coal in Ohio, we have agriculture in Ohio, but we also have a whole lot of other stuff too. And so when politicians campaign in Ohio, they tend not to over-focus on any one industry because there's really no reason to, because the state's economy is so diverse. And if there are certain fluctuations in different industries, it doesn't affect Ohio quite as much because it's not so reliant on one industry, be it for the state's political culture, but also for employment. I think at one time you could have described Ohio as a manufacturing state, and while manufacturing is important in Ohio, manufacturing employment both nationally and Ohio is far less than what it used to be. Finally, the state does not have a dominant political ideology. So these are our 2 U.S. senators. Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, is on the left of the picture and also politically. And then Rob Portman on the right in the picture and politically Republican. And you have to ask yourself, how could a state elect both Sherrod Brown, who is one of the most liberal Democrats in the Senate, and also Rob Portman, who's a pretty stalwart conservative? And the reason, I think, is basically luck, in that when Sherrod Brown first ran for the U.S. Senate, it was 2006. George W. Bush was president then, very unpopular. Democrats had a great election in 2006. They won control of the U.S. House. They won several Senate seats, including taking control. And one of the people who won was Sherrod Brown. Brown runs for re-election in 2012, a presidential year. Obama is running for re-election. He wins Ohio. Brown gets almost exactly the same share of the vote. So there wasn't a lot of ticket splitting. And Brown, I think, has been fortunate to run in both 2006 and 2012, which were good Democratic years. Portman, on the other hand, ran in 2010 for the first time for U.S. Senate. 2010 was a really good Republican year. Republicans gained a ton of House seats, took control of the U.S. House. They also made significant gains in the U.S. Senate. Portman picked the right year to run, just like Sherrod Brown did. And if you go through our history in Ohio, you'll find politicians at the Senate and gubernatorial level of all across the ideological spectrum. Of course, Portman and Brown are two good examples of a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat serving at the same time. John Kasich, kind of a conservative Republican governor of Ohio, but when he ran for president, he ran as more of a moderate. We've had Howard Metzenbaum, very liberal Democrat. John Glenn, not quite as liberal of a Democrat. One of our senators was Robert A. Taft in the 1940s and 50s, who was so conservative he was called Mr. Republican. So the state produces all these different kinds of politicians, in part because I don't think the state has a guiding political ideology, which makes some sense for a state that really is very competitive at the two-party level and has been for a very long time. Ohio has stayed very competitive in a country, even though the country has changed politically quite a bit in the time period I looked at going back to 1896. So on the left is the electoral map from the 1896 election. Republicans are in red, Democrats are in blue. And look at it, the Republicans are very strong in the north, the Democrats are very strong in the south. What happened after the Civil War was basically American elections turned into the Civil War at the ballot box. You had the party of Lincoln in the north, the Republicans winning almost all those states most of the time, and then you had the Democrats as the party of the South. Now look at 2012. It's almost exactly flipped. The Democrats are now the party of the North, the Republicans are more the party of the South, and yet Ohio voted basically exactly the same as the national average in 1896, and just in this past election, Ohio voted almost exactly the same to the national average. So even though the country's politics have changed quite a bit, and I'll get into why that is, Ohio has sort of remained at the center of the story in terms of deciding who gets to be president. This is also true at the county level in Ohio. So on the left is 1896, on the right is 2012. Notice that in 1896, William McKinley, the Republican elected president that year, who was an Ohioan, McKinley won 9 of the 10 most populous counties. That year, a lot of the Democratic strength was in the central and northwestern rural parts of the state. And then in 2012, Obama wins 9 of the 10 most populous counties as the Democrat, and Republican strength is really pronounced in central and western Ohio. It's almost exactly a flip of what we saw in 1896. So again, just like the nation, the different component pieces of Ohio have changed quite a bit over the last 30 presidential elections, but Ohio's place voting, very similar to the national average, has remained pretty constant throughout that time period. I think that if you had to pinpoint a key period in this 1896 to 2012 time frame as to when Ohio changed, and I think things changed nationally, I think you look at when Franklin Roosevelt was president during the Great Depression leading into World War II in the 1930s. So the map on the left is the Ohio electoral map, or the Ohio county level elections map from 1932. That's when Franklin Roosevelt first won the presidency. He defeated incumbent Herbert Hoover during the height of the Great Depression. FDR won by a really big margin nationally, but he only won Ohio by a very small margin, and so I say R+8 up there. That's because Ohio was 8 points more Republican in 1932 than the nation. It's one of the few years where Ohio does not vote close to the national average. And part of it is that while FDR, just like in 1896 for Democrats, did really well in a lot of the rural parts of the state and the western part of the state, the Democrats were still kind of weak in the big cities in Ohio. That all started to change both in Ohio and nationally after Roosevelt got elected. Roosevelt implements the New Deal. The Democrats become more clearly sort of the party of the working man. A lot of people who were recent immigrants and also African Americans were Republican. They shifted over to becoming Democratic starting in 1936, which is Roosevelt's re-election. And you can really start to see the pattern change. The dark blue, the most Democratic areas on the 32 map in the western part of the state, in a lot of the rural counties, that blue gets a little lighter because those places didn't really like the New Deal. They didn't really like big government. They were kind of conservative in terms of our modern outlook. But a lot of the big urban counties like Cuyahoga, Mahoning, which is where Youngstown is, a lot of the eastern part of the state starts to become really consistently Democratic. And by 1940, FDR's third election, the western part of the state, very conservative, very Republican by that point, and then you start to see a more pronounced Democratic strength in the eastern part of the state. And there are some exceptions, but this is kind of how the state votes now. The New Deal kind of changes things in which Democrats become clearly the liberal party, kind of the party of bigger government. The Republicans very clearly become the conservative party, the party of smaller government. And this is kind of the pattern that we live with today. And I think a lot of that foundation got laid down in the 1930s in the reaction to the New Deal and this big growth in the size and scope of government. So this is Ohio today, and how this is shaded is that the 10 counties that are shaded, that dark color, those are the 10 most Democratic counties in Ohio. They're the only 10 counties in the state where Democratic presidential candidates got 55% or more of the vote over the last 4 elections. So in Bush's 2 elections and in Obama's 2 elections. Those were strong Democratic in all 4 of those. The 20 gray counties, including Stark County, those are the ones that are kind of the battleground counties. They're the counties where the Democratic candidates got between 45 and 55% of the vote in the last 4 elections. And then all of those white shaded counties, 58 of the 88 total, those are all counties where the Republicans got 55% or more. So I mentioned about how Obama only won a relative handful of counties in Ohio. And this sort of shows it in that you've got some real pockets of Democratic strength in big city areas, particularly in the Northeast. 7 of those 10 counties are in the Northeast, and then you've got Lucas, which is Toledo. You have Franklin, which is Columbus, and Athens, People's Republic of Athens, home of my alma mater, Ohio University. One of the few sources of Democratic strength in Appalachian Ohio anymore. And what's interesting about this is, so if you read about elections in Ohio, and particularly with reporters from out of state coming here trying to pick a particular county to look at, in fact Stark is always a good example because Stark is always closely contested. But what happens is that if you would just take these 20 counties that are most competitive, if you just took them out of the state and set them aside, it would not change the results of any of the last 4 elections. Meaning that in 2000 and 2004, the 58 really Republican counties strongly outvoted the 10 really Democratic ones, allowing George W. Bush to win the state in competitive elections in 2000 and 2004. In 2008 and 2010, the 10 big Democratic counties outvoted the 58 really Republican ones that allowed Obama to win the state twice. The swing counties don't really determine who wins because they all kind of just cancel each other out. So what may be more important than whether a candidate wins or loses a place like Stark County by a significant margin or not, what may matter more is for the Democrats getting maximal turnout in their core counties and the Republicans getting maximal turnout in their core counties. I think it's, particularly for kind of election geeks like myself, it's tempting to look at a county map of a state and say, oh, well, it's like the Electoral College and you need to win certain counties. But of course, you don't get anything extra for winning a county. It's not like the Electoral College, which is winner take all in a certain state. This isn't like that. And so it's all about what kind of margins you're getting out of your strong counties and how much you're holding down your opponent in their strong counties. So speaking of the Electoral College, let's broaden this out a little bit to nationally. So this is the current allotment of electoral votes that are given to the states. 538 total. You need 270 to win. Almost all of the states, all but 2, are winner-take-all in the Electoral College, meaning that you win a state, you win Ohio by 1 vote over your opponent. You get 18 electoral votes. Your opponent gets nothing. The 2 exceptions are Nebraska and Maine. They actually award electoral votes by congressional district. So there are 2 statewide electoral votes in each of those states that go to the statewide winner, and then it's whoever wins the individual congressional districts that get the rest of the electoral votes. And so actually in 2008, John McCain won Nebraska very comfortably, but Barack Obama actually carried one of the congressional districts in Nebraska, so he got an electoral vote out of that state, even though McCain won statewide. Now, why 538 votes? Well, so it's based on the allotment of senators and members of the House that each state get. So, of course, we have 100 senators, 50 states. Each state gets 2 senators. So each state starts with 2 electoral votes. And then every 10 years, the census determines how many members of the House each state gets based on population. So a state like California, which is the most populous state, it gets 53 of the 435 House members. So the reason it has 55 electoral votes, 53 members of the House plus 2 senators gets you to 55. So 435 House members plus 100 senators, 535. And then the District of Columbia, which does not have a voting member of the House and does not have senators, it does get to vote for president, so it gets that additional 3, and that's how you get to 538, and again 270 to win. Let's talk about the strategies for winning presidential elections. This is Richard Nixon from the 1960 debates. That was the first year we had televised presidential debates. The first debate didn't go so well for Nixon. He was sick. He was coming off of he had hurt his knee. He didn't look particularly good on television. He's going against John F. Kennedy, who is a much more telegenic candidate. Those debates are remembered not for just being the first televised debates, but also because it's a very famous election. But Nixon ended up losing in a very, very close race. But Nixon employed an interesting strategy that year that led to a lot of second guessing. And that was that Nixon made the pledge that he was going to visit all 50 states during his campaign. And what happened is that there was 1 state remaining that he had to go to as election day was getting closer. And the state was Alaska. So he had to go all the way up to Alaska. He was there on the Sunday before the election, while Kennedy was barnstorming a lot of the competitive states in the East and the Midwest. And when Nixon ended up losing very close, it was easy to say that that was a mistake for Nixon to make the 50-state pledge. However, there was something defensible about a 50-state strategy back in 1960. And that was that most of the states were close. So in a close national election, 20 of the 50 states were decided by 5 points or less. And that included a lot of the biggest states like California and Illinois and Texas. Actually, Ohio was decided by a little bit more than 5 points in 1960, but Ohio was close and competitive, New York was close and competitive. And so it made sense to go all around the country campaigning because you really had a chance to win many of the states. And in fact, Kennedy himself visited 43 states that year. So it was a truly nationalized campaign. The same thing was true in 1976, which was when Jimmy Carter won the White House very narrowly over Gerald Ford. In that year, too, 20 of the 50 states were decided by 5 points or less, and you had kind of a more nationalized election. That's not true today. A 50-state strategy would not make any sense today because most of the states vote in very predictable ways. So this is this represents how many times over the last 4 elections the states have voted a certain way. So the dark red states have voted Republican in each of the last 4 elections. So they voted for Bush twice, for John McCain, and for Mitt Romney. The dark blue states voted all 4 times Democratic. So they voted for Al Gore in 2000, John Kerry in 2004, and Obama in 2008 and 2012. Notice there's a lot of dark red on that map, and there's a lot of dark blue. 40 of the 50 states voted the same way in the last 4. And in this most recent election, only 4 of the 50 states were decided by 5 points or less. Ohio is one of them, North Carolina, Florida, and Virginia. But compare that to the 1960s and 70s when you had almost half of the states as being very close and competitive in those elections. We still obviously have really nationally competitive elections. I wouldn't say that any of the last 4 elections were blowouts. The biggest victory was Obama in 2008, and he only won by 7 points. You know, compare that to Richard Nixon in 1972 and Reagan in '84, they won by about 20 points nationally, so 7 points is good, but it's not a true landslide. And yet, despite the fact that the elections are very competitive in terms of the national popular vote, many of the states are not that competitive. And the reason I bring this up is just to say that Ohio was a good bellwether state really for most of the last 30 election cycles, and even before that, with just a few exceptions. The difference is that back in the 1960s and 70s, there used to be a lot of states like Ohio that voted close to the national average, that both candidates, Democrat or Republican, could conceivably think about winning. Today, Ohio is one of the few states that still votes close to the national average and is hypothetically winnable by both candidates. And so Ohio is going to get an immense amount of attention from the candidates in terms of campaign visits and in terms of campaign spending. Donald Trump was just in Cleveland today. It was his 8th visit already to Ohio since the conventions. He's been here, I think, 13 times overall since he wrapped up the nomination in early May. Clinton has been here quite a bit too. To put it in perspective, looking back to 2012, after the conventions, the 4 members of the presidential ticket, so Barack Obama, Joe Biden on the Democratic side, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan on the Republican side, they made a combined roughly 250 campaign stops across the country. 73 of them were just in Ohio. 40 of them were just in Florida. So you could see how the campaigns really just focus on a very small number of states, because there's not much reason to run television ads in Texas because it votes 10 points more Republican than the nation generally. Or in California, which votes 10 points more Democratic than the nation. Or Illinois or New York, which are very Democratic. Or a lot of the red states in the South and the Great Plains. The campaigns really just focus on a handful of states, even though these elections are very competitive nationally. So for us in Ohio, you're going to see a ton of campaign ads. Obviously, you already have. The candidates are going to be visiting here a lot. If you live in California or New York State or Texas, the candidates will probably show up to go to fundraisers with the wealthy people who live in some of those states. But otherwise, they're really not going to be holding campaign rallies, and they're not going to be running television ads. So it's a blessing or a curse, depending on what you think about the candidates in the election. Here's another way of looking at Ohio from 2012. Kind of a funny editorial cartoon here. A lot of good details on there, so I'll let you take a look at it. But you can actually see that the states that he shaded in white were really the ones that were most competitive in 2012, and really that really could be the case in 2016 as well. And then the rest of the country votes in such a predictable way that they don't get much attention from the candidates. So at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, where I work, we do electoral college handicapping, and this is our current handicapping of the presidential election. We have 272 electoral votes, at least leaning to Hillary Clinton, so we see her as the favorite. 197 at least leaning to Trump, and then 69 electoral votes worth of toss-ups, including Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, and Nevada. Now, as of last week, we had Clinton at 348. So the election has changed quite a bit in the last few weeks. The polls have gotten tighter across the nation, and Trump seems to be doing better now than he really has at any point of the general election campaign. And so I think that Clinton is still probably a narrow favorite, but not as big of a favorite as she was, again, even 7 to 10 days ago. And in fact, Ohio itself might be leaning to Trump. There have been 4 polls of Ohio over the last 7 days. Each of them had, well, one of them had Trump up by 3, and the other 3 had Trump up by 5. So the election's getting closer, and Trump may actually have something of a small advantage in Ohio at the current moment. And I think for this, there are a few reasons. First of all, to the extent that Ohio has deviated from the national voting over this 30 election period, it generally is a little bit more Republican, to the point where, other than Indiana, our neighbor to the west, which is the most reliably Republican state in the Midwest, Ohio is kind of the gateway to the Midwest for Republicans. If a Republican can't win Ohio, generally speaking, a Republican can't win a Michigan or a Wisconsin or an Iowa or an Illinois, because those states are generally at least a little bit or a lot more Democratic than Ohio is. You've probably heard the factoid that no Republican has ever won the White House without Ohio, and that is true. If you go back to 1856, which is the first year that we have both a Democratic and Republican presidential candidate, so our two-party system starts in 1856, right before the Civil War. 40 presidential elections since then. Ohio votes for the winner in 35 of them, and the 5 times Ohio didn't vote for the winner, it was to support a losing Republican over a winning Democrat. And so Trump has to win Ohio to win nationally. Ohio is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Republican presidential victory historically. You would not expect Hillary Clinton to carry Ohio but to lose the general election, because no Democrat has ever done that. Now, there's a first time for everything, but that doesn't seem likely. So that's the history, and then there's the demographics. So first of all, Ohio is whiter than the nation, and that has political significance because nationally about 70 to 75% of the electorate is white. And white voters generally vote more Republican. White voters voted for Mitt Romney 60% to 40% in 2012. About 25 to 30% of the electorate is non-white, so African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, etc. Those voters voted for Obama 80% to 20% in 2012. And so there's this stark racial divide in American politics, and if a state is whiter than the nation, as Ohio is, you might expect it to trend Republican over time because whites are Republican and arguably getting more Republican. And then there's a little wrinkle in this election that I think makes the state even more favorable to Trump. And that is that there's this increasing education divide in the white electorate right now. So basically, Trump is really doing well amongst whites who do not have a college degree, so kind of working class whites. Whereas Clinton is doing better than Democrats typically do amongst college-educated whites. Ohio's white population doesn't have as high of an education level as the national average. And so there are a lot of, if that education gap holds up in this election, I think that probably benefits Trump because of the demographics of Ohio. So you put it all together, and I don't know who's going to win Ohio, but I feel very comfortable saying that Donald Trump will do better in Ohio than he does nationally, both for demographic reasons and for historical reasons. So with that, I am with Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Again, we handicap elections. We do a free newsletter, typically comes out every Thursday morning, in which we try to pick the winners. So if you're interested in signing up, centerforpolitics.org/crystal ball. Or if you want, just Google crystal ball. The first thing that will come up is an Amazon ad for an actual crystal ball you can buy, and then, which has nothing to do with us. And then the next thing that comes up is a link to our website.